an online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists and the Affiliation of Ministers, Theologians, and Philosophers, two divisions within the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Brian Groyle, and I'm president of the biology group. Tonight's event is the fourth in a series of collaborative events that we are hosting on the broad theme of the human soul, human identity, and human consciousness. Past events in this series have considered both monist and dualist perspectives and have featured theologian Joel B. Green, Christian philosopher Dean W. Zimmerman, and Christian neurobiologist and ASA fellow Bill Newsom. Tonight, we begin a two-part exploration of near-death experiences, which certainly ties in well with the theme of our series. First, we'll focus on the science of near-death experiences and its possible implications for the localization of human consciousness. In May, we'll have a follow-up event that provides a theological and philosophical consideration of the possible implications of NDEs, near-death experiences, for the afterlife. This evening, we are delighted to have Dr. Jeffrey Long as our guest speaker. Dr. Long is a full-time radiation oncology physician practicing in Kentucky and a prominent researcher of near-death experiences, which we'll abbreviate NDEs. Over 25 years ago, he founded the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, or NDERF. The website, available in over 30 languages, serves a global audience and hosts the world's most extensive collection of scientifically studied NDEs, with over 4,000 accounts. Dr. Long's research is featured prominently in his New York Times best-selling book, Evidence of the Afterlife: The Science of Near-Death Experiences. He is also the author of the book, God and the Afterlife: The Groundbreaking New Evidence for God and Near-Death Experience, which was published in 2016. He has appeared on major television programs, including NBC's Today Show, The Dr. Oz Show, National Geographic, The History Channel, CBS Inside Edition, The O'Reilly Factor, and many international broadcasts. His recent podcast interviews have reached millions, further broadening the impact and recognition of his pioneering work in NDE research. The title of Dr. Long's presentation tonight is Near-Death Experiences and the Mystery of Consciousness: Exploring the Boundaries of Mind and Brain. Dr. Long, it's great to have you join us.
I really appreciate that kind introduction. As we said, we're going to talk about near-death experiences and the mystery of consciousness. What we're presenting today here is going to be one of the largest near-death experience studies ever reported. I just very recently updated this, and here come some of the fascinating findings from that. And let's see here. It's not, there it goes. As was mentioned, I wrote a New York Times best-selling book as the debut of my research. That immediately became life-changing. It was a New York Times bestseller 8 days after it was published, and we went over all the variety of places that I've given this presentation, listed in part there. Just absolutely extraordinary local interest where I was at, churches, hospice, Rotary. It's been a real opportunity in changing my life to do this kind of outreach and give this kind of talk to many, many groups, literally around the world over the last 25 years. One thing I want to start out with is there was an essay contest organized by a billionaire, Robert Bigelow, Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, called BICS. This was an essay contest where he wanted authors to provide 25,000-word essays for the best evidence of life after death. So because the prize money was so huge, there were over 1,000 essays submitted, and a panel of 6 very qualified judges reviewed 200 of them, and I was honored to be in the runner-up group. I would submit that what you're hearing today is an update of what I submitted for that BICS essay contest. So what you're hearing is through that panel of judges and that very competitive essay contest, literally among the most stringent scholarly peer review that is possible. In the 29 essays that were accepted as basically either the top three winners, me and the runner-up group, or honorable mention. Near-death experience was the most common essay topic for providing evidence of life after death. And again, it's going to be an update from that, what I presented there. So I would say, given this original research I'm presenting today, is certainly, in my opinion, and I think by the consensus of the BICS essay contest people that submitted and their judges, is among the scientific evidence for an afterlife, what we'll be talking about today. So what exactly is a near-death experience? Well, as the name implies, you're near death. You're so physically compromised, or that may be even clinically dead with absent heartbeat. Now, at that time, where you shouldn't have any kind of lucid memory, you do. And it's at that time you have a lucid, organized experience, which is the experience part of a near-death experience. I want to emphasize, even after studying over 4,000 near-death experiences, no two near-death experiences are the same. However, me and the other researchers that have done a lot of research in this find a very consistent pattern of elements or characteristics, what occurs during a near-death experience, these elements that typically occur in a consistent order in near-death experiences. As noted, it's been over 25 years that I've been doing this. The website that I founded for this was NDER, for Near Death Experience Research Foundation. This is a public service. If you go to that website, you'll see nothing for sale, and we don't really solicit donations from that website. We really believe that people, the thousands of people that have shared with us freely over the years, we are morally obligated and ethically obligated to share them back freely with the world. As we go through this, I want you to keep in mind that, as we all know, as scientists here and researchers, in science, what is real is consistently observed. And that is what's so striking about near-death experiences. They're very consistently, the content, what we see in them, as you'll see as we go through this talk, very consistently observed. I want to give a special thanks to my wife, Jody. She was an attorney who has practiced for many years. She's now retired and stepped down and served as webmaster of ndurf.org and handles the mammoth amount of experience reviews, posting, processing. And I absolutely could not do what I do today, working as a full-time physician, without my wife devoting her full time to the attentions of NDER. She shares my passion for sharing this type of very important information with the world. Well, who exactly has a near-death experience? A Gallup poll published in 1981 estimated perhaps as many as 5% of adults in the United States had a near-death experience, and several other studies of near-death experiences have come up with an approximate percentage like that around the world. You know, what's interesting about near-death experiences is when you have a life-threatening event, you really can't predict who will have a near-death experience, nor exactly what the content will be. I co-authored a scholarly book chapter where we tried to predict from demographic variables what the content of near-death experience would be based on review of several decades prior research, and you really can't. Only about 10 to 20% of the people who nearly die are going to have a life-threatening event. That means 80 to 90% don't. So again, we have no way of predicting who that 10 to 20% that nearly die will. But near-death experiences are, if you will, an equal opportunity experience. They happen to anyone, and that's children and adults, physicians, scientists, clergy, religious, atheists, and even those who never heard of near-death experience and don't believe anything like that was ever possible. They all have near-death experiences. Bottom line, anyone, anywhere can have a near-death experience. So we're going to be talking about evidence of the afterlife and the consciousness of the afterlife. You can use the word soul regularly as we start talking about consciousness apart from the body. The good news is I'm certainly not alone in my research interest on this. There have literally been hundreds of prior scholarly articles regarding near-death experience published in the leading medical and scientific journals. And we're actually seeing more and more being published in recent years than was even before. Now, I'm going to be presenting what will seem to be some pretty remarkable things, but please understand what's real is consistently observed, and so there's tremendous corroboration of the major findings of what I'll be talking about today with prior scholarly research, mainly smaller studies, but we're all finding exactly the same thing with a variety of different ways of accessing near-death experiencers. And again, don't forget the BICS essay contest, which, again, the people that had their essays about near-death experiences for that essay contest, again, identical to what we'll be talking here today about content. I'm going to talk about 12 lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences and its consistent message of the ability of consciousness to exist apart from the physical body, and that is a soul. First of all, let's start out with the fact that near-death experiences have crystal clear consciousness. Now, to understand how amazing that is, understand after cardiac arrest, after your heart stops. Well, immediately when your heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain at once. 10 to 20 seconds after your heart stops beating, the EEG or electroencephalogram, which measures brain cortical activity, goes absolutely flat. It should be impossible at that point in time to have any kind of memory at all, let alone the lucid organized memories of near-death experiences. However, in the 984 near-death experiencers that I surveyed in the most recent version of our survey, I asked them directly, how did your highest level of consciousness and alertness during the experience compare to normal everyday consciousness and alertness? Amazingly, even though these people are unconscious or clinically dead, about 78% said during their NDE they had more consciousness and alertness than normal. Only 17.8 felt that their consciousness and alertness equivalent to earthly daily life. And wow, look at that, less than 5% felt they had less consciousness and alertness. Again, dramatically illustrating that special higher level of consciousness during near-death experiences than their earthly life. The other interesting thing about consciousness and near-death experience is that near-death experiences are remembered verbatim years to decades later, and that's been validated in both prospective and retrospective studies. People may say, I don't remember for sure what I had for breakfast a week ago, but that near-death experience I had 15 years ago, I remember absolutely explicit and down to the finest detail. So it seems to be a very special type of consciousness. Well, second line of evidence is these real out-of-body observations. About 45% of people that have a near-death experience will have their consciousness separate from their body, typically going above their body, and from that vantage point, they can see ongoing earthly events with their unconscious or clinically dead body down below. They see ongoing events which may include the frantic efforts of people trying to bring them back to life, to resuscitate them. So my research question is, well, is it real? Is what they're seeing actually real with their consciousness and point of vantage over their body? Two good prospective studies, Dr. Sabam and Dr. Satori, studied this and indeed found in admittedly a small group of people that what they were seeing seemed to be accurate down to the finest detail. There was a Dr. Jan Holden who reviewed all prior near-death experience literature that described out-of-body observations or studied it, and she found even with very stringent criteria, in other words, if even one tiny aspect of these observations was not real, she threw it into the unreal category. So even with stringent criteria, 92% of these out-of-body observations published in the literature were without any apparent inaccuracy whatsoever. My own study, we had 287 people that had these out-of-body observations during their NDEs, and a whopping nearly 98% of these out-of-body observations were without any apparent inaccuracy, both by my determination of the experience or the description of the people having the near-death experience themselves, which is absolutely astounding and shows how accurate these observations are. And we talked about out-of-body observations with a point of conscious reference over the physical body. We have scores and scores of near-death experience accounts where those observations out of body were far geographically from the physical body and far beyond any physical bodily awareness. Just as one example out of scores and scores, probably well over 100, we had a person who had a near-death experience. They were riding a horse, fell off the horse, banged their head, boom, instantly unconscious, actually to the point of coma. It was a life-threatening event. Initially out of body, over their body, laying on the ground, saw the horse start to return to the barn where other people were. Consciousness traveled about a mile away. From that vantage point, she saw and heard what people were talking about while her physical body was a mile away. When she recovered from that close brush with death and asked the people who were there, boom, down to the finest detail, what she saw, what she heard, exactly accurate, exactly at the time that she was literally comatose a mile away. On NDERF, we have the ability to use artificial intelligence to pull out what seem to be out-of-body experience components in near-death experiences. And really the bottom line, there are at least 700 near-death experiences that describe these out-of-body observations of earthly ongoing events. Probably higher than that. That's all that our AI could find. So really, with that, there's just a massive number of near-death experiences with this description. So again, very powerful evidence that consciousness can exist apart from the body. And yes, I firmly believe that that is an aspect, initial aspect of conscious awareness of a non-physical soul, literally. And that's what these OBE observations are all about. In fact, if it's not the soul, what the heck is it? So that's why I'll refer to it as the soul quite regularly. But line of evidence number three, near-death experiences can occur in the blind. Now, blindness varies. You can be blind all your life or develop blindness later in life. You can be partially blind or you can be totally blind. But near-death experiences in the blind, including those totally blind from birth, have been reported. In fact, I interviewed a lady named Vicky, born totally blind, who the first time she saw her body was after she had a bad car accident. And just to deal with the usual question I get with this, nope, she wasn't driving. She was a talented singer and was singing at a bar. And unfortunately, an inebriated patron tried to get her home, and boom, severe auto accident. First time she saw herself, she had that out of body experience, consciousness above the body. And there was a body down in the gurney in the emergency room. And she was initially horrified because vision was so unknown to her. When she calmed down, she was able to correlate what she'd only known by sense of feel in all her life, her long hair, and interestingly, a ring that her father had given her, she knew by the sense of touch. Boom, now she correlated it and was aware that that was her hair, her ring, and her body. She went on to have a typical, well, very detailed near-death experience, tunnel, life review, meeting deceased loved ones. One thing about Vicky, which we see in a number of people that have near-death experiences, is she had 360-degree vision. She was simultaneously aware of visual content in front of her, back, or right, left, up, down, technically spherical vision. So we now, we had our most recent version of the survey, we asked directly about their prior visual impairment prior to their near-death experience. So we actually have a series of people that were either legally blind or severely visually impaired at the time of their near-death experience. In all that reported in this series, their vision was either normal compared to earthly vision or even supernormal as Vicky with 360-degree vision. So, well, let's illustrate that. Let's ask Marta G. To quote this near-death experiencer, she was 5 years old, and unfortunately, her parents lost sight of her, and she went out to a lake. In Marta's words, I breathed in the lake water and promptly lost consciousness. I was pulled out by a beautiful woman who was dressed in bright white light. She looked into my eyes and asked me what I wanted. I was completely satisfied and at first could think of nothing. Finally, it occurred to me that I wanted to take a trip around the lake. In my journey, I saw detail I would never have been able to see in real life. By simply intending, I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees. I was legally blind. For the first time, I could see leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles and in people's backyards. That was far more clear than 20/20 vision. Mundane things like leaves, bird feathers, which would not be exciting to us. If you're seeing it for the first time in your life, like Marta, absolutely remarkable. A good illustrative example of near-death experiences with vision in the blind. Okay, so already you're probably realizing there's some pretty powerful evidence for the reality of near-death experiences, for the consistent observation of consciousness apart from the body, or the reality of a soul. Well, wherever there's evidence for soul, you're going to find NDE skeptics. So regarding near-death experiences, I would point out that over 30 different so-called explanations of near-death experience have been provided by the skeptics over the years. And I've heard it all. It's been sort of a niche of mine to catalog and then respond to these so-called explanations of NDE. I've heard every physiologic, psychological, cultural explanation you can imagine. Now, you might ask, geez, why do there need to be over 30 explanations for how near-death experiences occur? The answer to that is very easy. The skeptics as a group themselves simply can't agree on any one or several of their skeptical explanations of near-death experience that they accept as adequately explaining near-death experience. And you'll see that as you go through here with the mountain of evidence. There's really nothing that skeptics can explain in terms of physical brain function that could possibly explain this mountain evidence that we already have presented and will continue to. I like that skeptic down at the below there. That's probably, I don't know what a skeptic looks like. It's probably something like that down at the bottom there. So anyway, you watch out for skeptics. Technically, by the way, skeptic so-called explanations should scientifically be considered as hypotheses of brain function possibly explaining NDE. And as you go through this, just decide for yourself if any possible physical brain function can account for NDEs. Well, line of evidence number 4, we have scores of near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia. This means while they were under general anesthesia having surgery, their heart stopped. Now, don't forget that's very carefully monitored when we administer general anesthesia, and consciousness absolutely should be impossible. It's doubly impossible to have general anesthesia and have a lucid organized experience, and it's we previously discussed when your heart stops, you shouldn't be having lucid experiences. Put the two together, it should be absolutely impossible. Well, I studied 23 near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia. They absolutely occur. The content is very typical of what occurs under all NDEs under all other circumstances. I looked at 33 NDE elements, what occurs during the near-death experience. There was no statistical difference between the anesthesia NDE group and NDEs under all other circumstances. Using chi-square statistics, 32 of 33 elements occur equally often. Interestingly, those that had NDEs under anesthesia statistically were more likely to have a tunnel experience. I don't know why, but a critical thing is that consciousness question we asked earlier about their degree of consciousness and alertness during their NDE compared to their earthly everyday consciousness. No statistical difference at all between the anesthesia group and the NDEs under all other circumstances group. So absolutely, I would submit this line of evidence just single-handedly should establish that physical brain cannot possibly be accounting for what people describe as occurring during an NDE, given all that. So here's an interesting one, life review. During a life review, I put down 14% there. Other researchers say it's probably closer to 20%. But I studied 88 people that had a life review. What happens in a life review is during their NDE, they become aware of part of their prior life. It flashes. Often the common descriptor is a screen or multiple screens where they see different aspects of their life. A minority actually have a more detailed life review where they describe every prior event that they become aware of during their NDE. And as astonishing as that is, you heard me right. I mean, these people are unconscious or clinically dead, typically or commonly during a life review for minutes, and yet here they are reviewing years or more often decades of their prior life. Again, a dramatic illustration of acceleration of consciousness in NDEs. But getting back to my 88 NDEs that had life reviews, my question was, is there any reason to doubt what they saw in their life review? Did it really happen? How do we know? So I looked at that to see if there was any reason for me to doubt or the NDEers to doubt their life review themselves. Bottom line, perfect playback. Very often if they had forgotten memories, and this is often like in toddler age, where they would have normally forgot what happened then, if they saw it and then they went back and checked with their parents, gee, did this event actually happen? Virtually every single time, they verified what they previously, as real, what previously happened in their life that they'd long forgotten. As we said, that's just incredible acceleration of consciousness. And I always add this because the very first talk I gave to a public group on NDE, people looked very concerned around this time. And when the question and answer period came up, it turned out that some of them were afraid of having a frightening life review because they'd done some things they weren't too proud of. Okay. Don't worry about that. The great news for everybody is there's essentially no judgment that occurs during a life review externally. I mean, people that have a life review darn sure can form their own opinion or judgment about their prior life events, but thank goodness there's no external being or beings that judge what they see during a life review. And actually, the life review is a very powerful learning tool and very much contributes to the very positive changes in people's lives after an NDE. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. This just came in just in the last week, so I thought I'd share it. Had an NDE due to electrocution. The grid expanded before me, vast and intricate like a cosmic neural network. And then it happened. I began to re-experience my entire life. but not just from my own viewpoint. I became everyone I had ever interacted with. I was my mother cradling me as a newborn. I was the stranger I brushed past in adolescence. I was the friend I ignored, the rival I condemned without understanding. I felt what they felt, every emotion, every thought, every ripple caused by my actions. Then came the possibilities. I was shown what might have been. What if I had stayed? What if I had offered forgiveness? What if I had made a different choice? Each moment branched into countless realities, each as real as the one I had lived. I witnessed them all, not as dreams, but as lived experiences. In what felt like mere minutes by Earth's measures, I lived 1,000 lifetimes. Time lost all meaning. Only awareness remained, only truth. I passed beyond the boundaries of light and then turned back toward it. But it wasn't just light, it was something greater, pure intelligence, infinite love, timeless being. I didn't see a figure, but I sensed the presence, a consciousness so vast, so tender and wise, that every human word for God seemed so small. This is a very rare near death experience. Number one, it's only a small percentage of life reviews in which they actually feel or are aware of the emotions or the thoughts of people they interacted throughout their life. Although, again, we've got scores of them, they're not rare. This is very rare to have a ability to understand what would happen if you made a different choice and then become aware of consciously what would go on. That's down to very rare, although again, we do have a few accounts like that. But again, just a very dramatic example of how consciousness can accelerate in a way far beyond anything that you would possibly be aware of on Earth. And this person encountered a being that he felt the word God seemed so small. Hang on to that, and we'll revisit God later on that occurs in near death experiences. So here's a family reunion. It's not at all unusual for near death experiences to encounter deceased loved ones. These are joyous reunions. There can be a lot of interaction. So, what happens when they encounter deceased loved ones during their NDEs? Well, I studied 84 NDEs where they encountered their deceased ones who had died on Earth in these unearthly heavenly realms. These are joyous reunions. Interestingly, of the beings they encountered when they were in that unearthly, that heavenly realm, only 4% of beings they encountered were definitely alive at the time of NDE. And the beings they encounter may be huge surprises. They may be relatives or siblings that they never met. We have a small series of children who had NDEs that encountered a sibling that they became aware was a deceased brother or sister that their parents hadn't told them about. That happens when parents are heartbroken over the death of a small child, will often not tell their young child about the death of their sibling until they believe they're old enough to understand death, maybe around 10 or 12 years old. But in this small series, every time the deceased sibling that they didn't know existed was a boy or a girl, when they tell their astonished parents what happens, that is corroborated. That's exactly what happened. They died, and the gender is correct. In fact, they may encounter people in these heavenly realms that they didn't even know were dead, and yet here they are. Oh, I would emphasize pets occur as deceased pets in near-death experiences. And I mean, you name it, dogs, cats, horses, birds. We've seen it all, but deceased pets, as with deceased humans, occur in the heavenly realms. These are joyous reunions and very touching for people that are pet lovers. In these deceased loved ones, there is certainly a preponderance of relatives. There was a Dr. Kelly who also corroborated that when people encounter beings in heavenly realms, only 4% are definitely alive. Dr. Kelly found the same percentage. So again, virtually everybody deceased. And by the way, that's a good example of the special consciousness of near-death experiences, of dreams, hallucinations, for example. If you are aware of somebody that you knew in your earthly life, almost invariably they will be alive. They'll be the bank teller you did business with, a family member you said hi to before you went to bed, but not all other altered types of consciousness. If you have an experience, it's almost always going to be someone who's alive. Not so with near-death experiences where beings you encounter in those heavenly realms, 96% are deceased. So here's an interesting one from the mouth of babes, near-death experiences in children. So just to try to assess the impact of pre-existing beliefs on the content of near-death experiences, I looked at 26 NDEs in very young children, and I mean very young. The group was age 5 or less. And this really is a sort of an ideal study group because children, and the average median age, by the way, in that group was 3.5 years old. So kids that young are practically culturally a blank slate. They almost certainly don't have well-formed religious beliefs. They have almost certainly no detailed awareness of what happens when you die. They almost certainly don't know what a near-death experience is or wouldn't understand it anyway. In those 26 NDEs I studied, though, again, we had those same 33 elements of a near-death experience compared to the content of near-death experiences of older children and adults. And there was no statistical difference between the ND content between the very young children and the older children and adult groups. So again, absolutely amazing that even at that very young age, NDEs are strikingly similar. There may be some variation on details of the content that's appropriate for their very young age, but that's as far as the major characteristics or elements are identical. And that's been corroborated by a Dr. Sutherland, who some years ago did a review of all literature published regarding children that had near-death experiences. And her conclusion from that study, age does not seem in any way to affect the content of NDEs. And I certainly agree from my study. So let's talk about near-death experiences around the world. As was mentioned earlier, our website and the survey that we have is in over 30 different languages. So this has allowed us to do by far the largest cross-cultural study in near-death experience that's ever been done. My conclusion in brief is that the content, again, those characteristics, the elements of an NDE are strikingly similar anywhere in the world they occur. Language can get in the way. In other words, how do you describe something that is unearthly, that is difficult to describe in human language? So there is some of that issue with that, but as far as the content, it's strikingly similar. Interestingly, I'm just working on writing up the largest non-Western near-death experience study ever. That's defined as countries which are not predominantly Judeo-Christian. We've acquired 51 non-Western near-death experiences and compared the content to near-death experiences everywhere else in the world. Once again, the bottom line, the content, what occurs during these NDEs, strikingly similar, which is absolutely amazing. It seems like no matter where on the world you may be when you have an NDE, makes no difference whether you say a Muslim in Egypt or Hindu in India or Christian in the United States. Anywhere on the planet you have an NDE, the content will be strikingly similar. I also, as part of my study I'm writing up, looked at 217 NDEs shared in non-English languages. Again, every characteristic, element, what occurs during an NDE is there, but in some differing proportions, and I'm pretty sure that it's due to the translation of the website survey or the translation of their responses that may be problematic. But again, strikingly similar for all NDEs everywhere, regardless of the language that they are shared in. So another thing that is important to know about is, well, as you can imagine already, the impact of having a near-death experience is profound. We see changes, which we call after effects, very consistently in both retrospective and prospective NDE studies. So over and over, we see an increased belief in the afterlife, reduced fear of death, value, loving relationships, less materialistic, and increased belief in God. And there, hanging in there at the bottom of this slide is a study I published in September to October 2024. This was the largest study of NDE after effects that had ever been done. We had 834 NDEs, including the survey questions about after effects, changes in their values and beliefs after their NDE. And we had an interesting control group of 42 people who had a life-threatening event without any experience, without an NDE, that interestingly completed the survey. And so we also were aware of their changes in values and beliefs afterwards. So when we compared the two groups, it was striking how people that had near-death experiences were literally orders of magnitude more likely in comparison to the life-threatening event-only group to have these after effects of increased belief in God, greatly reduced fear of death, interestingly, greatly increased compassion, greatly increased belief in the meaning of life. So we saw that very dramatically demonstrated in this study. A smaller study with similar methodology found the same thing. So these after effects are not due to nearly dying they're due to having a near-death experience. And here's just an illustrative slide of just exactly how the magnitude we're talking to. We asked a question in our survey about what they felt about the meaning and significance of their earthly lives prior to their near-death experience, and then after their near-death experience, after they shared it, an average, by the way, in our study group of about 15 years later. So this survey, and you can look at it in blue font, prior to their near-death experience, only about 27.5% felt that their earthly lives were meaningful and significant. And down at below, after their NDE, wow, look at that, 80.4% believe their earthly lives meaningful and significant. And I submit to you, I cannot think of another single life event that would result in such a profound shift in this kind of value as a near-death experience, a profound shift in what, and we have this in many, many of these other aspects of these types of value and belief questions are similar to this order of magnitude of change over time. Oh man, now this gets an award for the busiest slide of the day. The point on this slide is, if you look basically at the bottom left slide, you can see that people in NDE scale, all these NDEs that we're presenting today, the series of 984, all were not only having a lucid organized experience at the time of a life-threatening event, but the major research scale for near-death experiences is called the NDE scale, and you have to have 7 or above for it to be called an NDE and entered into my study. But if you look at the bottom left, people that had the most detailed NDEs, that being an NDE scale of 25 to 32, and 32 is as high a score as you can get, 100%, that is 48 out of 48, believed an afterlife definitely exists. So these life changes in values and beliefs, far more noticeable in people that have had the most detailed NDEs as measured by the NDE scale. So line of evidence number 10, this is really interesting. We're up now, need to update this slide. We're now up to we're up to 17 people that have had what we call a shared near-death experience. Now, what happens in a shared near-death experience is you have 2 or more people that have a simultaneous, same time, life-threatening event to the point that both of them are unconscious or clinically dead. So interestingly, remarkably, they can share a near-death experience. They can share what they observe. They can communicate with each other. And that is very dramatic, relatively rare, but they certainly do occur. And when we have shared near-death experiences, these are typical near-death experiences. They're like all others we've talked about. They're just sharing it, typically in my series with 2 different people. And let's illustrate that from William. William, and this is up in Canada, by the way, I was in the car taking my girlfriend to her parents' home in Welland. I fell asleep while driving. I then realized that we were out of our bodies and flying quickly upward, holding hands. They were engaged, by the way. We flew straight up for about a minute. We then saw a park or countryside-like landscape. Suddenly, we encountered 4 creatures. 2 flanked each of us, and they began to separate us. They were holding hands gently. They overwhelmed us with a feeling of the highest love and compassion beyond anything we could experience on earth. We were feeling a divine love. Therefore, we did not resist their efforts. I felt sort of like a baby in mother's arms, though it's hard to describe accurately. 2 of the creatures moved her upward toward the distant landscape, and 2 moved me back downward. I felt so much love, peace, and comfort that I wanted to protest and say, no, please let me stay here. But I heard inwardly or psychically that I couldn't stay. Next, I saw my car in flames from about a quarter mile above. I felt a falling sensation and awakened in the car. The front was on fire. I moved her from leaning on me as she was when I fell asleep, knowing that her body was only an empty shell. I had left her above with the beings, and indeed, she was dead, and they had shared in their final, literally touching moments, a shared near-death experience. This is some very suggestive evidence that if you have permanent irreversible death, what we're describing in near-death experiences may be the initial step towards permanent irreversible death. So that's a very dramatic shared near-death experience. Well, here's another line of evidence, number 11. I mean, we hear about near-death experiences and we hear them described. Well, heck, if you want to find out if near-death experiences are real, Why not ask people that had near-death experiences? I did. I asked 984 about that. So here's the results from that survey. How do you currently view the reality of their experience? Wow, look at that. Nearly 94% stated their experience was definitely real out of those four options. Nearly 4% thought probably real, and less than 2% of people that had a near death experience felt it was either probably not real or definitely not real. Very dramatic endorsement of the reality of NDEs from people that actually had that close brush with death. And furthermore, out of people's ability to generally understand reality, if skeptics of NDE want to represent that NDEs are not real, then it's their burden of proof on the skeptics to present strong evidence that NDEs are not real. And as you can probably tell from what we're discussing already, no way they can't do it. And that's why skeptics don't have any explanation for brain accounting for these very dramatic experiences. So I studied near-death experiences for many, many years. And, is there an afterlife? And obviously, yes. And is there a soul? Well, from this mountain of evidence already, absolutely a soul for all of us. Well, if there is an afterlife, if we have a soul, if we are really eternal soul beings, what can we learn about it? So this is where, at least in my opinion, the research started to get interesting. I really had to be convinced with previous research before I was absolutely dead certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, that near-death experiences were indeed real, were indeed exactly what near-death experiencers described, that being soul apart from the body and a venture into a heavenly, unearthly realm. So if that's going on, well then, gosh, what can we learn about it? Answer, pretty fair amount. There's three major afterlife concepts in near death. Well, there's a lot. There's many, many, but I've just, for the interest of time, I've picked mainly three, which are among the most commonly expressed in near death experiences. And in fact, if you ask, this was 866 sequentially shared NDEs, we just pulled out the descriptive words that near death experiencers themselves used to describe their experience: light, love, God, were obviously, as you can see, way above many other types of things that they encountered that they described. So these are certainly important to near-death experiencers, and so that made them important to me as an NDE researcher. Okay, let's talk about love. Light and love, the two most common words used in near-death experiences. So fascinated about seeing the concept of love over and over, I went right after it in the most recent version of the NDER survey and asked, of 984 near-death experiencers, during your experience, did you encounter any specific information or awareness regarding love? Wow, look at that. Over 55% answered yes, which is a whopping high percentage. That is a far, far higher percentage than described tunnels or encountering deceased loved ones or having a life review or some of the other more classic things that has been described in NDEs, over 55%. Only a little over 7% were uncertain, and just a little over a third said no. Now, following this, we encouraged those that answered yes or uncertain to provide a narrative response. And so the text box response, in response to this question, offered valuable insights into just what is this love during the NDEs they're encountering. So let's take a look at that. And here's some quotes, direct quotes from near-death experiencers. I knew that love was the greatest force around us, and that we are all love, and love is the only thing that is real. Love was everywhere. It permeated the afterlife. It was incredible. Love is the root of all. It is the Alpha and the Omega. I was loved unconditionally, despite my faults and fears. I was loved, and it was unconditional. A love so great and peaceful as though it enveloped my whole being. The entire experience was one of unfathomable love. During the experience, everything was love. I was love. The whiteness was love. The feeling of flying was love. It was awesome. This is just a very limited number of quotes from NDEers down at the bottom, and I believe that the organizers will post this URL with my talk today, but we literally have hundreds of direct quotes from people in response to the question about love and near-death experiences on that URL. You can go through that and you can see vividly how dramatic and how unearthly and how absolutely amazing love is when it's described in these heavenly realms during near-death experiences. by the majority of near-death experiencers. Now, interestingly, another thing that is very common in near-death experiences is the concept of connection, unity, or oneness. Interestingly, in near-death accounts, they're much more likely to use the stronger word unity than just a connection that they encounter with all things and all. So here's how we explored that in my most recent version. Asking the survey again directly of 984 NDEs, during your experience, did you encounter any specific information or awareness that a mystical, universal connection or unity, oneness either does or does not exist? I had to throw in that or does not exist to try to allay the skeptic's concerns that I was a biased leading question. I didn't, I felt we needed to do that. But again, those that answered yes or uncertain were asked to provide a text box narrative of the text of what they were describing. And I will tell you, in the text box response following this question, basically 100% of those answering yes, that remarkable 46.7%, were saying yes, they actually did encounter information or awareness about a universal connection or oneness. So once again, amazingly high percentage, nearly half answering yes, only about 10% are uncertain, and a minority, under 50%, say that they did not encounter that information about a unity or oneness. And now, information about a unity oneness is so different from what we know in our earthly everyday life, where we're far more cognizant of our separation, our differences from other people. It's especially important to go over some illustrative quotes from NDEs about just what the heck that means. So here's, again, direct quotes from near-death experiencers. I was aware of a oneness, a connection with God and all other souls, but also individuality. We are all pieces of a greater whole, as I understand it, and getting back to where we can all be together again is the ultimate going home, as in heaven. I felt a universal connection or unity, but it really didn't seem mystical at the time. It just felt like this is how it is. I'm going to say yes, because I felt a larger than universal oneness. I felt connected to everything and everyone on earth and across the universe. I felt if anything I said or did had greater repercussions than I could ever realize. And the oneness on the other side is amazing. You become one with all of life. All is connected, all one, all is love. And by the way, if you go to the Webster Dictionary definition of love, which is so commonly seen in NDEs, one of the prominent words that Webster describes, and I think appropriately in love, is a connection. So I think this sort of unity encountered in NDEs is just a manifestation of the ultra love, the unearthly, heavenly love that near-death experiencers describe that is outside of general individuals' life experiences. But again, see for yourself literally hundreds of descriptions straight from NDEs about this so-called mystical unity or oneness. So there's a URL down there. Again, the unedited narrative responses of hundreds and hundreds. Again, dramatic reading to really drive home that point. And again, God, one of the more common things that near-death experiencers describe. So I went ahead and asked the same 984 NDEs the key question during your experience. Did you encounter any specific information, awareness that God or a supreme being either does or does not exist? Again, asking it with the or does not binary form, just so it isn't entirely leading. And again, as previously in the text box responses following this question, basically everybody of that 48.4% were answering yes. They did encounter information that God or supreme being exists. So again, a whopping high percentage. I mean, nearly half of people having near-death experiences being aware of God, barely over 10% uncertain, and a minority, even under 40%, saying no. So again, a very, very common thing that near-death experiencers encounter. So, well, gosh, isn't that interesting? Let's drill down a little bit, looking at those text box responses and try to understand that. Before we get into that, here's an example of encountering God in a near-death experience. This was from Sandy. In August of 1985, when I was only 5 years old, I was on a boat trip on a local lake. I was bitten by a mosquito and developed encephalitis, brain inflammation. I died and drifted into a safe black void of comfort and ease, no pain and no fear. This was a place where I felt right at home. Off in the distance, I saw a very small light. It was drawing me to it. I felt myself rushing toward this light with a great amount of speed. I was not frightened. When I came into the light, it represented peace and joy, but most of all, a deep unconditional love. The light was sparkling, glowing cloud. From inside, I heard a voice in my head, and I knew it was God. Since my parents never discussed God or took me to church, I really don't know how I knew, but I did. Furthermore, I felt like this was my real home, this place where I was with this beautiful light, which was God. I felt surrounded by the light and was one with it. The feeling was like being scooped up and held by my daddy when a barking dog was biting me just a few months earlier, only more so. 5-year-old encountering God during their near-death experience, consistent with virtually all other NDEs, when God is encountered, it is an instant, complete knowing. You almost never encounter NDEs where they're in doubt or wondering if the being that they encountered in their NDE was or was not God. There's essentially always a certainty. But let's hear some more about that from Lonnie. In that same moment, he, God, showed my golden threads interwoven that made me me, but that I did not exist alone. My golden energy threads extended throughout the universe, and they were not mine at all. We, humanity, are all woven together, and we are all part of God's tapestry of sorts. There are really no words that can adequately describe this. In between the golden threads, however, he leaves each of us empty spaces. The way he showed me is that we can fill up these empty spaces between the weave of threads with light or with darkness during our lives. We are made of God, but we are given free will. He has only to glance at us to know how we spent that free will. There is no way to hide any of it. And just a little bit more of God, near-death experience quotes. God is everything, energy, the fabric of everything. You know it is a supreme being by the all-encompassing love and warmth within and outside of you, all around you and through you, every part, in every moment. I did not believe in God before my experience. The presence of God, the forms in which God presented itself to me were undeniable. I wasn't just given information, I experienced the information, so I would absolutely know it to be true. So we've talked about love and we've talked about God. Just a little bit more about God. Probably the number one thing people describe in terms of a descriptor of God is God's love. So here we go. Again, into ear quotes. No human can ever love with the kind of love I felt in that light. It is all consuming, forgiving. Nothing matches it. It is like the day you looked into the eyes of your child for the first time, magnified a million times, indescribable. It wasn't just that I felt unbelievable love, I was unbelievable love. God is love, and that God is within me and all of us. I know that love is all there is, and that God loves all of his children deeply and equally. There are no stepchildren in the family of God. We are all divine. And God loves us all infinitely. So again, there's that URL down at the bottom with hundreds of those narrative descriptions. Here's a snippet of just a few, but again, as you scroll through literally hundreds of these, you, as so many other people, would be absolutely astonished at the stunning consistency of how people describe God. A very dramatic journey for those of you that would like to go to the original source of data, of evidence on God and near-death experiences. So we can make a number of conclusions on this, but we have, as you can see, 12 lines of evidence. There's actually more, so multiple converging lines of evidence are all coming down on the obvious conclusion that near-death experiences are, in a word, real. There is a strikingly consistent message of the reality of a soul with unearthly consciousness, far beyond what we know in our earthly physical life, along with the reality for all of us of an afterlife. Again, this is a strength of multiple lines of evidence with, hundreds and hundreds of near-death experiencers all describing remarkably similar things. So there's many messages from NDE research, but I think some key messages are death is not the end. It is a new beginning. There is a beautiful afterlife filled with a vastly expanded state of consciousness. We are all deeply connected, and love is the very foundation of the universe. And these are among the most profound and uplifting truths, as far as I'm concerned, ever revealed to humanity through human experiences. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Long, for that fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Okay, let's start with Philip Graybill. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciated the talk. Just curious if there were any negative experiences that were documented.
Yeah, about 2% of near death, a very common question. I get this a lot. Um, about 2% of experiences are objectively frightening, and that means hellish. You can have a subjective sense of fear during near death experiences. There's some percent that have that, but as far as the actual, truly objectively frightening, distressing near death experience, about 2%. So they're rare. I would be the first to say that this is, to me, one of the great mysteries of near death experience. I don't think I fully have it understood, but I will tell you, in the dozens that I've studied that were objectively frightening, first of all, they are really scary. They can have demonic beings, sounds, smells, noises, sense of evil are permeating throughout these NDEs. In my few dozen NDEs, there's sort of two ways that you can be aware of this evil demonic presence. One is at a distance. It's not unusual for near-death experiencers to be moving often with other spiritual beings in these heavenly realms. And when they sort of feel, sense, or are aware of that evil demonic realm, hell, if you will, it's a separate, segregated area of the environment they're passing through. So when people say there can't possibly be a hell in heaven, that's technically correct. They seems to be segregated, separated from the other souls, the other beings in heaven. The other thing, even you would think that people that were very antisocial would be a lot more likely to have hellish NDEs, and that's not real clear from the evidence we have. Of those that do have these hellish NDEs that actually are impacted directly by these beings and environment, interestingly, it's not at all unusual for them to call out to God or Jesus, please rescue me from this. And generally, boom, they get immediately removed from that realm. Other people, when they have these hellish experiences, will come back and say, I needed, if you will, a spiritual kick in the pants to get over these resentments, angers, that darkness in my own life and to confront it. And there was no other way that I was going to be able to confront these issues in my own earthly life, deal with them, and progress and move forward. So it's fairly common for people, even if that have encountered the darkest of experiences and near-death experiences, to literally see the light after the experience and become very positively compassionate, changed beings for the rest of their life. So that's a very brief overview of a very complex subject that I don't think anyone fully understands. We have artificial intelligence has allowed us to pull like maybe as many as 100 NDEs with hellish content. So that's a work in progress I have. When I run out of things to do and other projects, I would love to sit down and tackle what remains as perhaps among the greatest mystery to me of near-death experiences, that being these hellish realms.
So a couple of questions, if I may. First of all, any significant differences or errors from the original studies in the 60s and 70s, made famous by Moody?
Yeah, Moody published Life After Life in 1975, and that got it going. It was actually some years later that we started getting good, credible research and accessing enough people that had NDEs that we could know this. Things really haven't changed. I mean, Moody described near death. He had like over 60 in his original book, which was amazing. And really what we have today is pretty much what Moody described from his book back in 1975, that out-of-body experience, the tunnel light being very common. So we're really not seeing a lot of change in NDEs over time. And I've been doing this 25 years, and I was concerned about the Oprah effect, where people would read NDEs and then incorporate that into what they describe for their own NDE, and we're just not seeing that. And it's not just me, because about 50,000 people read our NDERF website every month. There's a mammoth number of people, and we just haven't heard concerns from me or anybody that's gone over this series where people are using similar phraseology, describe experiences where you could say, wow, that's a copycat experience. So very vividly, both by my own, my wife Jody, and by the tens of thousands of people that look over these experiences. These all seem to be unique narratives. So that's a good question.
And a second question, in terms of people's interpretation, it seems to be very much, and this has been one of the critiques of NDEs, is the very much endorsing a universalistic, almost New Age, Eastern philosophical type religion. And I just wonder if, if you've been able to identify any, first of all, in terms of proportion of people, correlations with religious beliefs, I guess. And I'm talking specifics. I know they happen. It's not. Doesn't happen only with certain people, but I mean, there's some thought that Christians might have fewer experiences than
well, yes, that's a good question. Now I see where your earlier question was going. One of the very earliest NDE researchers who will remain mercifully anonymous had the NDE hotel and had some number of NDEers, and who was a very New Age-ish person themselves. And unfortunately, that seems to have been projected into a number of NDE accounts. And we're talking about like late 70s or very early 1980s. We're not seeing that. There doesn't, I mean, we post these full texts of the narratives on our website, edited only for spellings, obvious spelling and grammar, and to protect named individuals. As you can see very vividly, when you look over any number of those NDEs, there really isn't that kind of New Age stuff that we had from all that time ago. I think, again, a lot of it's due to interpretation. Certainly, people are people. If they have a near-death experience, there are a distinct minority that will have sort of New Age beliefs. But in general, these are people from every walk of life, and they go on continuing in their pre-existing every walk of life. And there is no reason to believe that Christians have more or less near-death experiences. We know that because we asked directly in the most recent version of the survey their religious affiliation. We actually took the Pew Forum designation of not only Christian, non-Christian, but specific beliefs like Protestant, Catholic, etc., and a number of different sects of Christianity. And they're right about the same percentage that you would expect in the population, which is predominantly United States, that we see. Of those that are Christian at the time they have their near-death experience, the significant majority retain, the great majority stay Christian after their near-death experience, and the majority stay in the same sect of Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, etc. So it's only a distinct minority that actually make major shifts, as in toward New Age. Actually, New Age is interestingly one of the options we give people, and that's a very small percentage select that after their near-death experience. So we're just not seeing.
Right. I mean, that term's not really used much anymore, but some of the descriptions you had, we're all divine, everything is love. I mean, that could come straight from Eastern philosophical, universalistic, humanistic type religion. Anyway, just
my job as a scientist is not to put a spin on this, but to simply report it verbatim and give hundreds and hundreds of descriptions. So that's really what NDEs say. Don't really perceive that as New Age. In fact, most of these, don't forget, the significant majority seem to have those types of experiences and yet embrace Christianity the rest of their life.
I guess my concern is the overinterpretation. People say, "Oh, it's Christian. It's proof that everybody meets God," and it's not necessarily, right. And just the same with the afterlife. We know that there's something happening, but if I'm using the Bible as a basis, anyway, I won't keep going.
I know where you're coming from. My job is just to report the facts exactly as they come and post them back up on the website. Right. So it would be, to a lot of people, there are certainly a lot of people that have had near-death experiences, obviously greatly increased belief in God. So people that have NDEs and encounter God, the great majority of those that have that are believing God, in the reality of God, much more so than pre-NDE.
Let me just say that in May, we're going to have a follow-up event where we will look more carefully at the theological and philosophical implications of NDE data, as Dr. Long has described. And there'll be comparisons with scripture and so forth. So that wasn't really the intent of tonight's session, but stay tuned for that because it's a very important aspect of this discussion. Douglas Jacoby, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you for a compelling presentation. So maybe my question is for May, but I can say it because it's very short.
Yeah.
Christians see Jesus, Muslims see Muhammad, Hindus see Krishna.
Right. For non-Western NDEs, there's a very noticeable lack of encountering religious beings specific to their religion. And that we have 51, it seems to be, that's enough of a number that I believe that, and other researchers have found that too. I actually co-authored a scholarly paper about Muslim NDEs with an Iranian NDE researcher, and I asked him directly, well, why aren't more people talking about seeing Muhammad during their NDE? And his response was interesting. He said, in Islam, that would be very frowned upon. You would really be really doubted, and there would be a lot of concerns raised if you reported that you saw Muhammad. And let's not forget, a lot of these Muslim nations are very suppressive in terms of freedom of speech. So I think that has a lot to do with that. I'm guessing, I don't know for sure. Jesus is a much more interesting thing. Approximately 7% of near-death experiences encounter Jesus. So I've acquired about 150 of them. I was interested in that and started a study just because I was fascinated. So Jesus can appear variably, not a surprise to me. This is not Jesus in an earthly physical life. This is Jesus in near-death experiences, non-physical. And that's a concept you have to be aware of. In near-death experiences, it is not a geographically separate physical realm. It's non-physical. Time is either radically different or doesn't exist. Communication is essentially always non-physical. Telepathic is the closest word we have. And we've even had a small series of beings that appear in near-death experiences that ask directly, how would you like for me to appear to you? So Jesus does appear regularly in near-death experiences, is clearly a distinct being from other beings that may be in NDEs in terms of a sense of overwhelming love. Jesus often in NDEs will be there as basically to listen or to be with the near-death experiencer, commonly during life reviews, often near the end of the experience where they have a choice about staying in this heavenly realm or returning to their earthly life. So that's Jesus. Interestingly, it's what he does not that's interesting. Jesus does not give commandments or directions about what to do with the rest of the NDE's life almost ever, consistent with the overwhelming consistency of free will being a theme in near-death experiences. So that's just a real quick summary on about 150 encounters with Jesus I've studied.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Carl Lynch, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, my question's a little bit more sort of, scientifically oriented. Is there any correlation between the duration of the non-perfusion and then the NDE? Sort of related to that, when people wake up with some deficit due to their presumed non-perfusion, how does that affect, or can you still elicit an NDE from them?
Yeah, those are good questions. There's exactly one really good study that found that literally the closer to death you were, the more serious the physiologic impairment, the more likely you were to have a near-death experience, which is, the opposite of what you'd expect if NDEs were brain-induced. But that was one good study that established that, looking at hospitalized patients that had NDEs. We do, unfortunately, there can be some severe, often neurologic or other physical body sequelae from these life-threatening events. The survey we have is very difficult. It's over 80 questions. People that are seriously neurologically impaired are going to have a huge problem completing that. We have some very poorly written, not very many, but some poorly written NDEs because of neurologic adverse effects after that life-threatening event. There doesn't seem to be, if they have physiological or neurological impairment after their NDE, at least in my series, there doesn't seem to be any mystical, inexplicable healing or reversal of that after their near-death experience after they go on living. I mean, they're still impaired and need to work with their healthcare team about that. Did that answer?
But they still have an NDE.
Yeah. They have, they have, good gosh, they can have severe head injury, cardiac arrest with brain hypoxia for a long period of time. So yeah, it's not unusual. I mean, the majority of the people that respond to our survey don't have any obvious neurologic or physiologic serious impairment after their life-threatening event that led to an NDE, but certainly a sad, significant percentage do.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned shared near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Have there ever been, or do you have data where there's been a shared near-death experience, both people recover and you talk to both of them and there's a correlation or not a correlation? Thanks for your answer.
Yeah, that's good. We only have 17 of them. Of the several that seem to be, in general, one person dies and one person returns to earthly life, and that's puzzled me too. I do not have any shared NDEs that I could say there were two people that had a life-threatening event, shared an NDE. Oh, actually, I do. Wait a minute. Yeah. We have, yes, there's we had one of the earlier ones, we had a walkway in a big building collapse, and we had multiple people that had a simultaneous life-threatening. I mean, there were several people that came back and were able to compare notes, what happened, but these are rare. I think like N equals probably no more than one or two out of the 17 that I have of people that had shared a near-death experience, and then after that were able to share what happened during the NDE following the event. For the other majority, one person dies and one person goes on living.
In that one case, were there people who kind of like knew each other, and when you talk to them that they had the same experience?
Yeah. When they have a shared near, I don't, again, this is from the survey, and we read, we read what they wrote, but yes, they were aware of each other in that out of body state and the near death experience. They most of the time when they have a shared NDE, they're able to communicate, interact with each other, and that was true of this situation too. And what they saw was, it was the same. What they were seeing, what they were observing, other bodies, that was corroborated between the two of them. It was corroborated with what was going on in terms of the actual accident.
Let's relate this to consciousness. So you mentioned that consciousness is separable from the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think consciousness originates in the brain and somehow as an emergent property, it is able to separate, or does it originate outside of the brain and the brain functions more as a receiver of consciousness? Because I think that's what Pim van Lommel believes, isn't it?
Yeah, he sure does, and I've read his work, and there's a number of people in the ND community that talk about the brain being a receiver. I have a different view from being a physician and having studied all these NDEs. There seems to be two very distinct types of consciousness. There are physical, earthly, everyday consciousness, and that's clearly brain produced. If you have a stroke, if you have a malignancy in a particular area of the brain, you will have very predictable neurologic sequelae that are directly a result of that damage to the physical brain. So I'm believe that is one aspect of consciousness, is what we exist with every day. Everything we have in near-death experiences is not physical consciousness. That's something that is not related to physical brain function and is not subject to the laws of physicality, such as gravity, such as limitations on velocity, such as being translucent or opaque to light. This is something completely invisible. When that consciousness separates from the body, it's invisible to other people. Its movement is non-physical. It has all properties of being, energy is the closest thing, but that doesn't really, energy is still a property of physical matter too. So this is something, what I believe is a soul is completely different from any physical brain function. In that unearthly soul consciousness, that's where you can have what we call universal knowledge. That's where near-death experiencers periodically report being aware of everything. Again, it's in that heavenly realm. It's part of, if you will, tapping into that all-knowing. movement in that soul being it's non-physical. It's not limited by time or distance the way we know on Earth. So I look at it somewhat differently from von Lommel. I'm just not convinced of the brain being a transceiver and being significantly affected by non-earthly consciousness in our everyday earthly life. Having said that, the soul is obviously a part of the physical body. That non-physical entity of soul is clearly within us and a part of us. So I do think the soul interacts and is certainly a part of our physical, earthly, everyday life. And I'm sure probably most everyone on this audience can be aware of some impact of soul, or if you will, higher consciousness, soul of themselves that has given them information or been informative or helped them in their life. But that's my opinion. That's certainly not anything that we know for sure, but that's my best take on the evidence that I have available.
You mentioned that the average amount of time between the experience and the filling out of a survey is 15 years. And obviously the children under 5 years old are not filling out surveys at that age. They would be
Right.
quite a bit older.
Right.
How do you know that they are not being influenced by what they read in the time between they had their experience? And I think in your book you cited children as being kind of like the blank slate for not being influenced about NDEs, information about NDEs before they had their experience. But in reality, before they filled out their survey, they might have encountered information about NDEs. Could that have affected their recollection of their experience?
Right. Well, number one, as I mentioned, if you read large numbers of NDEs, it's very obvious that there's not copycat or duplicate language of other ones. These are people, each one of those 4,000 have expressed what they experienced in a very unique and special way. So we're really not seeing that at all, I mean, in all my NDEs. But secondly, as far as remembering that, I mentioned briefly that there was a prospective and retrospective study about people remembering it verbatim. The prospective was von Lommel. When he did the largest prospective study many, many years ago of near-death experiencers, he interviewed them a few weeks after their life-threatening event, 2 and 7 years later. And when he interviewed them like 7 years later, what they told of their experience was verbatim, pinpoint exactly what they shared even weeks after it occurred. So prospectively, with a pretty large, N equals over 60, the follow-up group probably in the 30s, we're remembering it verbatim. And then another major NDE researcher, Dr. Bruce Grayson, relatively recently published a study where he did that NDE scale, the research scale I talked about, and he looked at their responses to the NDE scale questions when they first entered his study, and then they took it again over a decade later, out even as long as 15 years, and found no statistical difference in responses to the NDE scale questions. Again, between prospective and retrospective evidence strongly suggesting that these NDEs are neither embellished nor forgotten years to decades later. And that's certainly consistent with the subjective impression of people that share near-death experience. I mean, there's certainly some that say they may have forgotten details, but that's a distinct minority. These people seem to remember it, as I mentioned, more accurately than what they ate for breakfast a week ago.
So the question I have is, you'd mentioned earlier about instances where people had a near-death experience where they were unaware of a sibling or a family member who had been born but had died before they were born, perhaps. I was just curious if there are any accounts of either like children before birth, so like someone who had been miscarried, like a child or a sibling that had been miscarried, or when that if that has any kind of maybe indication for when like ensoulment might happen, if I can use that word.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. You know what? I cannot directly. I don't recall. This is spread out over so many years. I can't be certain of a response to that. But that is a very interesting question. The ones that come to immediately to mind are deceased siblings that died after they were born. But that is a very important question about encountering stillborn people, stillborn siblings, and if so, some idea how long they were in gestation. I wish I had a good answer. I'm not going to speculate if I don't know for sure, but I will darn sure keep my eyes out on these types of experiences. And thank you. That's a very important, good question. And so we'll, hopefully I'll have a better answer of that and some specific examples, and hopefully even a small series as time goes on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, last question, Carl Pinkham, go ahead.
So you addressed this tangentially a little bit. Do the NDEs have any sense of body? And if so, what is that body? Not their body that they see below them, but the body that they're possessing.
Yeah, that's a great question. When they're in that out of body, if you will, soul existence, it can be all over the board, especially early on in NDEs or when their body is up. They may have sort of a common descriptor as they do, and they'll often they are like they're anthropomorphic. They can see their hands and legs, but they will often say that they're translucent, that there's a glow, that they're not like a typical physical body. So that can, and yet even early on, you can have people simply not having any awareness of any kind of anthropomorphic appearance of their own body as NDEs. And again, even in these heavenly realms, they often may walk like through a field or be there, and then they can sort of appear anthropomorphic, even though they're not physical. At other times where you have near-death experiences, especially where they're moving through, space, if you will, then they generally don't have any kind of appearance that is like a physical body. So it's quite variable, and it may vary over the time of their near-death experience.
All right. Well, it's time now to bring this session to a close. I want to thank again Dr. Jeffrey Long for being our keynote speaker this evening, and thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the affiliation of Christian biologists, the affiliation of ministers, theologians, and philosophers, and the American Scientific Affiliation. As I said before, our next event relates to near-death experiences and the afterlife, and we saw some answers to questions tonight, but we're going to explore this in more detail at our next event, which will be held on May 20th. So mark your calendars and plan now to attend. It will feature 3 Christian theologians and philosophers, Dr. Nancy Murphy of Fuller Theological Seminary, Dr. Kevin Corcoran of Calvin University, and Dr. Brandon Rickabaugh of Palm Beach Atlantic University. If you're interested in getting more information about the ACB, AMTAP, or the parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, send us an email at asa@asa3.org. Again, that's asa@asa3, the number 3.org. As we close out our event this evening, I'd like to ask Walter Rohiro, the president of the Affiliation of Ministers, Theologians, and Philosophers, to lead us in prayer.
Let's close our eyes together. Lord, thank you so much for this presentation tonight. Truly thought-provoking. The existence you give us is beautiful. And we're told that at the core of the universe is relationship, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And what an intriguing experience so many people have had of that relationship that's at the core of everything. And we pray tonight, Lord, that we would know you, that we would sense you, that we would have that knowledge that so many people report from near-death experiences, that we're truly not alone as we go through this world. Lord, fill us with a true knowledge of who you are, and Lord, make us instruments of your peace, of your light, of your ways, of your word in this world. And we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, be sure to check out the ACB group pages on Facebook and LinkedIn. That's it for our presentation this evening. Good night, everyone. Until next time.